No, Jim is not. Recording started. Okay. So I call to order the September 28th, 2022 meeting of the Finance Committee. We have a quorum present with 5 members. Jim Healy's not going to be here tonight, and Barry will be down after the hospital meeting upstairs finishes up. So we will commence our proceedings, and the first item on our agenda is citizens' requests to address the Finance Committee. Is there anyone either in the room or on Zoom who would like to do so? I don't see anyone, but after I finish that, I'd like to welcome. We have some guests today. Can you guys tell us who you are, please?
Hi, I'm Cody Sam, and I live in Wellesley. I'm here for the school.
Excellent. And how about you?
Liam Wilson. I live in Needham, and I'm also here for the school project.
And what schools do you guys go to?
Roxbury Live.
Excellent. How about yourself?
Same school.
Okay, well, Mr. Riley knows a lot about Roxbury. So you're in a good place. We all know that, so welcome. And so this is the Finance Committee. We are citizens of Needham, volunteers. It's a non-elected position, and we oversee the budgetary and capital aspects of the town, and then present the budget to town meeting, which takes place every year in May. So you're going to hear some. We have a special town meeting coming up in October, and some of the articles that are on that we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm glad you're here. And if you have any questions either tonight or any other time, please reach out. Okay. Thank you for coming. So anyone to address the committee? Okay. Then we'll move next to approving the minutes of our last meeting, which was September 21st, a week ago. The minutes have been circulated. I didn't see anyone with comments this week because you did such a great
Dick
job.
had some edits,
Dick has some edits.
but
Okay.
they were just technical.
Typos. So are we ready to take action on this?
Yes,
Is there a motion to approve?
so moved.
Okay, a second. Any discussion or comment? Hearing none, coming to a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So those minutes are approved. And so next, we're going to turn to the October special town meeting warrant, Article 8. And I understand that Adam is here and Katie's here. So if you guys would like to come up or sit there, whatever's easiest for you. And Adam, tell us who your guest is tonight.
Tonight, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Tonight, my guest is my son, Jeffrey Block.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
What grade are you in?
What grade? What school do you go to? Okay, well, we're glad you're here.
We won't hold that against it.
No, we're glad you're here. And I'm sorry, Jean's here as well.
I'm just about to introduce Gene as well.
I didn't see her behind me. I apologize. And we're operating somewhat in the dark because these lights are out, so it's not purposeful, put it that way. All right, so we're here on Article 8. Is there someone who'd like to lead the discussion on behalf of the proponents?
Sure, I can start us off, I suppose. We were here. Nice to see you, Karen. We were here, as most of you in the room know, at the Springtown meeting, in preparation for the Springtown meeting. And the Finance Committee had raised a number of questions about predominantly a similar effort. And as a result of those good comments and questions that came up here, it enabled the town to improve the process. And part of that was really on the select board side and the town management side, led by Katie King, who's present this evening, who conducted a review of the licensing laws, because I think a question came up about a distinction between a brew pub or a microbrewery and other restaurants in town that may serve alcohol, and question about equalizing the playing field for those types of businesses and uses in town. So So Katie and the select board underwent a liquor licensing review and updated our liquor licensing regulations. I think you have a copy of those updated regulations. And then we had some minor tweaks from the zoning. The zoning is predominantly the same. It sets out very simply two classes of uses. One is a brew pub and the other is a microbrewery. The distinction between the two is effectively relating to food, that a brew pub is a eat-in restaurant, a facility that is an eat-in restaurant that also happens to produce beer, not other forms of alcohol, just beer. And we regard its primary business as a restaurant, as would be any other restaurant. It would be a kitchen. It would be a place to clean dishes. There would be kitchen equipment to cook food of different kinds. Maybe a grill, maybe a griddle, whatever, ovens and so forth, whatever we would expect at a restaurant. There would be staff to, we would anticipate to wait on customers, to serve them, to sit, to show them where to sit and so forth. And there would also be in that space, big metal drums that you may have seen if any of you have ever been to one of these brew pubs. They have these large metal drums which are fermenters and goes through that process. We're not regarding a restaurant as between a brewery based on the size of either, because it's very possible that the nature of the size of the equipment that a brew house would have might take up a space larger than a place to cook a burger. And it may have some differing staff needs than the restaurant side of it would. I think a question has come up before about, well, how do we know what is a restaurant versus a brewery? How do we know, where's the distinction? It's a valid question. And I would say that there is a part of it that honestly may be a bit, a bit of the smell test. As my son might say, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, tastes like a duck, it might be a duck. Except here we're talking about brew a beer and not ducks. And yet the concept is similar enough. And what I mean by that is if the business is barely serving a burger or is serving a donut and it doesn't have much staff, but suddenly has a ton of staff because of the brewery operation, or a zoning officer, building commissioner, would be informed and would investigate. But rather we measure the distinction between a primary business and a secondary business, in part on more objective standards, which include several things. First, it includes, like any other restaurant in town, the volume of sales. If we look at the sales of the restaurant itself, we can clearly identify, as other restaurants do, how much of those sales are alcohol and how much of those sales are food. If we see that there is greater than 35% of alcohol in sales, that is a violation of the town liquor licensing laws that Katie can certainly speak to better than I. And yet we also would regard that if there were 50% of sales or 51% of liquor sales of total sales were liquor sales, then clearly it's not just a restaurant anymore. It's a different type of a business, and there's enforcement measures. We can call in the proprietor who sought the special permit that we may have by them granted and so forth and deal with that. But we know and also we know, based on the amount of beer that it's producing and how much of that beer is actually being sold to other establishments. And I say that because it's clear in our bylaw that no more than 40% of its production capacity can be sold to other, whether by wholesale or retail, to other establishments. You can perhaps imagine, a facility in what's now Cook that might actually distribute some of its own beers that it produces to, let's say, the James. And we can also measure that. We can measure the performance and the capacity. They're required under state licensing laws, to disclose what their capacity is. They're required, and we can certainly conduct an audit ourselves to understand how and track what sales have come from which part. So those are the elements that give us the local control to ensure and satisfy ourselves that that this is really a brew pub, and it is predominantly a restaurant that happens to brew a few of its own beers, as opposed to a microbrewery that is regarded as a larger facility. It has an ability to serve food. It's not necessarily its primary business. Its primary business is the production of beer. And it has a limit that it can't produce more than 15,000 barrels a year. And to give you an idea, if any of you are familiar with the facility, with a beer called Cloud Candy, it's produced in Waltham by a company called Mighty Squirrel. They produce, I think, about 17,000 barrels a year. And I think they're in about 17,000 square feet of space on effectively 2 levels, almost split evenly. And they, food service can come to a microbrewery by multiple ways. They could have their own kitchen. That's totally permissible. They could have a food truck. They could make arrangements for other food from other establishments in town are provided to the facility, to customers of the microbrewery. There's lots of different ways in which we can enable that.
Is the microbrewery required to provide some type of food like that, or could it just not do it at all?
So I'll let Katie speak to the liquor licensing element of that. Katie,
But that's
you
the
wanna address that?
food aspect of it.
Well, that's true. Yes, basically. They're required to provide. a
They're
measure of
required to
food.
do so. They can't say, no, we just want to microbrew and not have any.
And
food.
not have any food. They have to make food available, which I think is a function in part as well, separate from our zoning, of state liquor licensing laws.
It's a function of the local licensing under the select board. So I'm happy to
John,
get
the
into.
second page
Yeah.
of this sheet.
So, but that's something, is that the state required, or is that a Needham requirement that a microbrewery has to provide some type of food, whether through food truck or otherwise?
It is a local requirement under the select board policy. So for licensing overall, the license that a microbrewery or a brew pub would get at the state level conditions the manufacturing functions and the conditions under which both of those business models can sell what they produce for off-premise consumption. The conditions under which the sale of that beer can be provided for on-premise consumption is a function of the local licensing. So food requirements is something that the select board did embed in their changes to the
And the reason for
town's
that is,
regulation. To require food. So I want to answer your question, but give it a little bit of context. So this 2 business model, a brew pub and a microbrewery that's in the zoning definition, is mirrored in the liquor licensing policy at the state level, and then again at the local level. So if you are a brew pub under the zoning definition, you would go to the state and apply for it's Master General Law, Chapter 138, a Section 19D license, which is a pub brewery license. So under a pub brewery license at the state level, If you wanted to serve locally for on-premise consumption, you would apply to the select board for section 12 license, which is the exact same license that restaurants get. So the rules for brew pubs locally in town to serve for on-premise completely mirror, it is the same license as what restaurants get.
Yeah.
The difference is on the microbrewery
Right,
side.
that's what I'm focusing on.
Yeah. So on the microbrewery side, at the state level, you would apply for a section 19C license. The state law dictates if you get a 19C, you have to come to the select board and get a different type of license. That's called a farmer series pouring permit. That did not exist in the town regulations previously. That's what the select board added this past summer. So it's section 10 in the town's alcohol regulations. But the food component of that is the select board decided they did want microbreweries to have to require that food be made available to patrons, but the model by which a microbrewery provides that food can be very flexible. So in the regulations, it says a microbrewery could have a full kitchen and a common victualler's license, same as a restaurant. They could have a partnership with a food truck. They could partner with another restaurant. They could allow patrons to bring in food from off-site. So when a microbrewery comes before the select board for this pouring permit, they would have to provide the select board with what is your plan for food. The rationale was alcohol safety and making sure that people are eating and drinking together. Yep. If I could, Mr. Chair, Lee Newman was asking to get moved over if you're amenable, our planning director.
Oh, yes, please.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, so I don't think, are you finished, Adam? I don't know.
Oh,
I interrupted you, so I apologize, but was there
I-
anything further you were looking to say?
Just by way of further background to this, that we're here because a question had been posed to town staff by a potential proprietor. There was someone who was curious about setting up this type of a use and wanted to know, is this type of use available in town or permissible in town? And that began a discussion with our economic development manager, our town planner, and our zoning enforcement officer. And it was clear that that the combination of uses for both a brew pub and a microbrewery were not together, were not organized together to allow these uses. And so the easiest thing to do to avoid any market confusion and to avoid any confusion within our town bodies was to set out an affirmative condition on what uses we would like and specifically where we would like those uses to be had. So that was the origination here, and hopefully someone might take advantage. And the reason why we would look forward to it is for a couple of reasons. As a matter of public policy, it diversifies our business inventory. It diversifies the number of business uses in town, which is regarded as a good public aim. And in particular, with this type of use, it is often done as a placemaking opportunity for residents of the town to come together and for visitors to come together. And I think what we've learned from the pandemic is there is a yearning among our fellow residents for placemaking in town, to be together and to be able to socialize. And yes, I don't mean to suggest that my son is a prop, I never would. And yet my son has come with me and my wife to these facilities, and we played ring toss, we played cornhole and other games. And of course, he was not drinking any alcohol, I assure you. But they had food available for him, and they had lemonade and soda available for him. And it was an opportunity for him to meet kids from other areas and to play with other kids as well. So that's just the context for us.
And if I'd add, because I know the finance committee is concerned primarily about the fiscal health of our town. I think it was 2 Novembers ago, because I always visit my daughter in a suburb of Rochester, New York on Thanksgiving. And she took me on a tour of the town of Fairport, where they live, which is on the Erie Canal. with old manufacturing buildings that of course had fallen into disuse. And the establishment of new brew pubs and also fairly large facilities that I suppose of the type we're defining as microbreweries. What my daughter was pointing out is how wonderful this has been for the town. You know, sleepy old downtown, and we went there in the evening, and there were people sitting outdoors. It was liveliness to this town that I had never seen before. And I think when Adam speaks of placemaking, that's what he's talking about. And also, I mean, we haven't done a fiscal analysis. We do that with big projects when we know for sure, you know, what's happening there. But I really think that this will have a good effect on our commercial areas.
Anyone else from the proponents who want to speak? And then I'll go to our questions. Anything, Katie, from you?
I'm happy to give as much of an overview. I don't want to be redundant to. the
No, I
materials
just
said
want to
in
make sure if
advance,
there's something you
but
want to say, you
proactively,
have that opportunity.
I appreciate that. Just that we got really good feedback coming to this group before Maytown meeting that gave us kind of the time and space to go back to select board and come back with a more comprehensive proposal. I think it's a better product for town meeting. So just to say, we appreciate that. And Matt Bradley sends his regrets. He was supposed to join us and he's sick. So this is more on the zoning side, but I don't know. This is a slight change in what came before May. So I don't know if you want to call out the geographic adjustments that were made.
So I think what we've done with regard to the uses and the geographic changes, and Lee, I'm going to call on you to back me up here, but if I remember correctly, we had a question about the, we've included it in the a brew pub I'll speak to first in the industrial district, but a brew pub is only permissible in that part of the industrial district that's within 150 feet of Arbor Street. And from that, as part of the industrial district that's located east of Route 95 or 128. Otherwise, it's not possible in other parts. Our industrial district has multiple parts to it geographically across the town. And the reason for this, the rationale why we have carve-outs, which is what we can speak to, is because we're looking to protect residential enclaves from these impacts. And so so that's one way in which we were able to do that. And that comes up again with a microbrewery. A microbrewery is only allowed in the industrial district that's east of 128. In addition to that, we've made some further amendments to the uses in the New England Business Center. And that a brew pub is only allowed in the New England Business Center in the part that's located west and south of 2nd Avenue. And with respect to, that was a microbrewery, as well as a brew pub. And then with respect to the Highland Commercial 128 district, that with regard to a microbrewery and a brew pub, that we're focused on, that we're only limiting this to the north of Highland Avenue or south of Highland Avenue and west of 2nd Avenue. The reason for that is if you're familiar with, let's say, Staples and the Panera Bread shopping center, there are two streets. Highland Riverside, I think, is one, and Highland Terrace, I think, is another. There are a number of homes there, and we're specifically looking to protect that residential enclave from the impacts of these uses. So that's why it's north of Highland Avenue, and that's why it's west of 2nd Avenue if you happen to be south of Highland Avenue. So I think, and then also with respect to the Chestnut Street Business District, if I remember correctly, we are on the west side of Chestnut and south of Keith Place. And that again is to protect a residential area near district or abutting the commercial district. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think the descriptions that you gave are accurate. I think the only thing I would add is that we had advertised, actually, including the highway commercial 1 district in the version of the zoning that was noticed for the paper. But based upon testimony that we got from some of the abutters with concerns about having that use in such close proximity to their residences, that district was eliminated. It is now no longer part of this proposal.
Mr.
Let me just, anyone else on proponents or? Okay, so we'll go to questions. Josh.
So I had a question about that geographic carve-outs as you described.
Yes.
So does that allow for different permitted uses within the same district, depending upon geography?
What do you mean?
So it sounds like parts of a district, this microbrewery would be allowed and parts that would not be allowed. Is that right?
So that's correct, but as between a microbrewery and a brew pub, there is a further distinction. A further distinction, for instance, in the industrial district. For the industrial district as a whole, we're only allowing a microbrewery in one part. As opposed to a brew pub, we're allowing in the industrial district, but in more areas within the industrial district than just this one area. And the reason for that is because the impact of a brew pub, which would be a larger facility, would have a larger impact.
So my understanding was that Massachusetts law didn't allow that. So chapter 48, section 4 requires uniform districts. So maybe you could just confirm that this complies with that law.
I appreciate you bringing that up. Lee will make a note of that unless Lee, you're able to speak to that, but I will say that town council.
We'll be glad to do a second check on it, although I will say we have done this in the past. We have this kind of a provision currently as a rule in our neighborhood business district where we allow for some mixed use development through a zoning change that was done within the last 5 years. So we have used this approach to regulate use in other districts.
And further, the last thing I would just add to that is both of these uses are only permissible by special permit. So that actually, provides the town with greater control and also, throughout the town where those districts are, where those uses are allowed within those districts.
Thank you.
Yeah, could you speak to, and I know, just walk me through understanding the fees and how the existing fees for restaurants and the brew pubs and microbreweries, like, is there parity? I'm assuming there is parity, but
I think that's a fair assumption, but I'm going to go to the local
Yeah.
expert, Katie King.
Good question. There is parity. So under the select board policy, again, brew pubs, their local license is section 12, so it's the same as restaurants. So the fee would be the same. I think the only difference is section 12, you can get a beer and wine license or an all alcohol license. So you would pay a higher rate if you got all alcohol, but that's consistent whether you're a restaurant or a brew pub. For microbreweries, the select board added the farmer pouring license fee to their fee schedule, and they matched it to the section 12 wine and malt license. So for this year, it's $750. I'd say, to put it in context, that's a 50% discount on what it had been in maybe 20 pre-pandemic. So that's a reduced rate, to give you a sense of.
Dick, did you have a question?
Yeah, maybe this should be to Ms. Newman. Are there any projections of the economic impact of this at all?
We have not conducted fiscal impact analysis for these, for changing our zoning bylaw to allow these two uses. We typically only do that when we're dealing with a large scale redevelopment of a particular area. As an example, what we did with the Muzzy site, which has now become Bullfinch's site, and other large scale projects, but not for something like this. We can say.
At the margin, it's reasonable to assume that this will generate rather than
Yes. So
a negative impact on the finance.
So to speak to some of those elements, a brew pub and a microbrewery has larger equipment, more more equipment and more expensive equipment. And so the personal property tax the town derives would be greater to the town than it would just for an ordinary restaurant. Further, because it has a tendency to be a placemaking type of operation, it's very common in other geographies, and we can reasonably anticipate the same for Needham, that if someone is coming to the microbrewery, wherever that may be, they may also go and patronize another business in town. And in addition to that, it will employ more people than just a restaurant would, or than just a brewery would. And it would diversify the mix as well. I should also note that while restaurants obviously contribute well to our town from a revenue point of view, from a cost point of view, these are similar uses to other restaurants, and they're not going to have an impact, a negative fiscal impact on other uses, on other town services, like schools, parks and rec, in some of those departments. There's obviously, as there are with, there is a measure of a cost element as there would be with any other restaurant, particularly any other restaurant that perhaps may serve alcohol, but it's not to a greater extent.
Louise?
So I have a couple of questions. One of them is we may not be able to quantify immediately whether this would be a benefit or not. Obviously, when we make a change, we're hoping for a positive economic benefit. So the two things that I'm curious about is with respect to a brew pub, it says that the sales shall not exceed 40% of the establishment's production capacity. And it does seem to be somewhat contradictory with the fact that they're being more treated like a restaurant in terms of the total amount of sales versus the food sales. So I think I'm not following something about how the calculations will work. And then I do have some concern about regulations not being lined up with respect to restaurants in terms of hours of operation for both on-site and off-site premise sales. I think that what we want to, and I think this was a comment that we gave last year, we want to make sure that we were very fair so that in no way would the introduction of a new type of, it's like a restaurant alcohol sale, interfere with what we already have for restaurants and for package stores. So if package stores are limited to not before noon on Sundays, then, really, we don't want to offer some other alternative that doesn't have the same hours. It's detrimental to our existing businesses. And so I just, want to make sure that those are addressed here. They seem to be addressed more completely than they were last year, but they're still not on par with each other.
I'm happy to speak to the hours. So in terms of hours for on-premise consumption, they are consistent across restaurants and brew pubs and microbreweries, and that's what's those are within select board control. The hours for off-premise consumption, because brew pubs and microbreweries get those permits from the state, from the ABCC, the state sets those hours. The one thing that is an option and a lever for the town is to look at aligning the package store hours with them. That did not come up in our discussion with the select board, but I'd say it wasn't that it was discussed and rejected. We didn't discuss aligning it, so it's certainly something we could look at a later point.
Although, just to draw a distinction to the business, certainly it's not, we can't. There is that retail component to it, right? So a retail component where alcohol is sold on a retail basis. We would anticipate to align those regulations. You had a
But they're not
question.
aligned right now, is what my point was.
So for example, Louise, you're looking at the package store versus restaurant,
Right.
hours of operation.
So
And are
Sunday,
they-
Versus
these-
the microbrewery in particular.
yeah, the microbrewery.
Those are comparable activities, you would think, yet their hours are different on Sunday.
What you were saying is if they had a retail store to sell like 6 packs of beer, that would have the same hours as a package store, but the restaurant might be different. If you were to go in and drink a beer that they draft, pour it on draft for you.
But
Right.
it doesn't
Right,
seem to say
okay.
that if you look at it.
So I will say, when the select board ran this process, we did notify all existing license holders of the proposed changes and had a public hearing. We did not hear from any package stores. But again, the door's not closed forever on that. And it's on the select board's goals to revisit if there's any additional changes to the liquor licenses beyond breweries in the future. So again, it's certainly something that can stay on the table.
Just from a practical perspective, is it customary for brew pubs and microbreweries to open at 10 in the morning? Is
So-
that realistic?
So, different jurisdictions, if you're in New Hampshire, Vermont, or if you're in New York or Connecticut and New Jersey, I think those laws are determined sometimes at the state level and you know, that we can, and Katie may be able to continue to speak on the hours of operation and what we would anticipate. We would obviously enforce that through the conditions within a special permit process to ensure that we're compliant with those, with the liquor licensing laws and regulations. And like Katie said, you know, if there is a need to, you know, to revisit those hours of operation, if there are, if that's something that sounds like the town is open to doing. Louise, do you have another question that was not answered?
No, I was just,
Maybe
I
you
just
have a
noted
comment.
your comment on the location restriction and the concern for impacts on neighborhoods. And if these really are not so different from restaurants, and I'm not sure I understand the concern for the neighborhoods.
Well, there are elements that are different. So for instance, on, if you're familiar with West Street and Highland Avenue,
Mhm.
and then a little bit farther down where Crescent Street is. So there you have a scenario where there are at least 40 residential residences before you enter into an industrial area.
Mhm.
And a brew pub, you know, would have different hours than a typical industrial plant that's already there. And as in an effort, for instance, to protect the kids that are playing soccer in front of their houses, as is common, you know, part of the way we can blunt the impact is by not allowing the use in that particular area. So, so the impacts, and those impacts of people coming at different hours, you know, is one way that we can control the impacts.
And if I may, I just want to clarify something. Louise, I thought perhaps you said that with regard to the sale of beer on the premises of a brew pub, what the definition provides is that malt beverages produced on the premises may be sold to other establishments. Or is possible one would operate without any sales to other establishments. There's no requirement that there be sales to other establishments. And just wanted to make that clear. If there is sales to other establishments, it can't exceed 40% of the production capacity.
I had two questions. One, Kate, can you fill me in on how this, the tracking of the 45% takes place? When is it done? Who does it? Is it done on a weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, yearly basis? So can you just educate me on how it exists now, and will it continue that way, or are you seeing that changing in any way if this was to go forward?
So on the licensing side, just to be clear, it's 35% of total sales. A restaurant can't exceed 35% of total sales on alcohol. It has to be majority food. So the enforcement and the tracking of that is through the town manager's office. The select board is the local licensing authority to monitor that. My understanding is that we have not done it during the pandemic, so this would be looking back kind of before my time with the town of it was done annually, and we would request that information from the licensees. So when the select board put the amendments out for discussion around breweries, and as I mentioned, we sent the changes out to existing license holders. We asked if there was anything else that folks were interested in having the select board take a look at. This was identified by some restaurants as something they would like the select board to take a look at, as it was right now, restaurants, it's a percentage of their floor space or total seats that can be in a bar service area. So if you think about like a traditional restaurant with a bar off to the side, in town now we have a lot more spaces that are more fluid than that. I think about like a French press, like where's the bar, where's the seating area? It's just kind of, the models have evolved quite a bit. So I think those two areas are not something that the board took up for the changes for breweries, because the select board's goal was, how do we make sure we have the licensing in place to support the zoning article? But I do think that those two changes I just mentioned are kind of up for further discussion.
And then as far as enforcement, you envision needing more resources to do the enforcement, to do the collection of the information and the analysis of the information, and making sure that the regulations where it's 35 or you change it to some other percentage. Just to understand, is there any sort of potential economic or something more that the town is going to have to do as far as resources, either people or otherwise, to track and potentially enforce this? And I think that you want to add on to
Yeah,
that.
just have there been any cases of someone not meeting, someone exceeding the 35%?
That I
issue?
can,
And what has happened to them?
yeah, that I don't know, but I can check on because in the last few
And it's
years.
expected, maybe a lot of people give an opportunity to, one fault is okay, two faults, you're out of.
Yeah.
the-
To your question, Mr. Chair, no, I don't anticipate any additional resources needed. I think there's capacity within the town manager's office to enforce it.
And my other question is to the planning board and also to the select board. Has this article been voted on yet by the planning board?
Yes, the planning board has voted to recommend this.
You voted to recommend it.
With an update that removes the use from highway commercial 1.
And how about the select board?
Dave, please correct me. Yeah,
I was not in the room when they were at that.
I believe they
section.
did vote to adopt it. Last meeting. Thank you, Peter.
They did?
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, any,
Can I ask just one more question, please, about microbreweries? So for microbreweries, then there is no 35% rule with respect to alcohol sales. It's basically all of their sales can be, 100% can be alcohol sales,
That's correct.
so long as they put a food truck outside the door, their area.
So long as, yeah, they have food available to patrons as approved by the select board when they apply for their license.
Pre-wrap sandwiches.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter what it is, right? Potato chips.
Lots of potatoes.
Lots of potato chips. Okay.
okay, any other questions? And if not, then I'd open up the discussion.
Just one last question. You mentioned the catalyst was somebody, interested in a group of microbrewery. What happened to that entity? Are they?
So that was almost 2 years ago. And I understand that that person has continued to track what's been happening here. There's been, I think, some discussion. It's known that Needham is looking to allow these uses, and other people have approached the town making inquiries and are tracking the effort. Um, So I hope that if we're able to pass this, that we'll certainly gate the opportunity, and I think that proprietors will come to the table, and then it's a function of site selection. This is an arduous process. There is significant financial risk, far greater than what's ordinary with another proprietor for a restaurant, because they have to go through a federal, state, and local permitting process, which is far longer than what you'd anticipate for just a particular restaurant. And even with a restaurant that serves alcohol, and they're at risk, they have to find a landlord that's prepared to, hold them for that period of time, while the proprietor is not generating any revenue and it's just all expenses out. So, so we hope that one or more may come. And the other comment I wanted to address is that, the select board has its licensing standards and requirements when it approves any kind of a liquor license. And it thoroughly looks at the business model and the impacts that will have on the town. The planning board has also its own regulatory controls for the special permit for the use of the space. And I think that taken together, we demonstrate, significant municipal responsibility to any proprietor, so that we're not creating a disadvantage, for other proprietors, or people maybe cheating a system with just potato chips. So I think that we would find that, there are all kinds of models and opportunities that can serve the town overall.
Look what we did.
No, it's too boring. You should start
If we
something more
were talking
interesting.
about Coca-Cola, your lemonade,
Yeah.
we might have.
I don't know, they probably thought they were hip and cool, huh?
All right,
This is for Dave. The 0.75 local option applies to both of these or not?
It would apply to that which is connected to the restaurant side, but does not, just like it doesn't apply to the package store.
So it wouldn't apply to the microbrewery unless they have a restaurant attached to it?
Anything that's not consumed on site, it wouldn't apply to. Of course, the complication is that was more straightforward until the changes that currently still allows for alcohol to be taken home from a restaurant, which would be subject to the 0.75 meals tax. But for a package store, for instance, that is not subject to the 0.75 meals tax. So to the point that the intended purchases be consumed there and later taken home because they didn't consume it there, I would believe that would be 0.75. But that which they're buying from, I'm envisioning refrigeration units where they pick up 6 bottles that in all likelihood would not be subject to the meals tax.
okay. Any further questions or comments committee members want to make? I just wanted to thank both the planning board and the town manager's office and the select board for listening to the questions that we made last May and or April, I guess it was. And so I thank you for doing that and doing the work that took place between then. And now, obviously, at least in my own opinion, it's a better product now than it was then. So I thank you both of you for that.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.
And do I hear someone want to make a motion?
No, Mr. Chairman, it seems to me that based on the presentations, I see no adverse financial impact from the uniqueness of it being a microbrewery or a brew pub. Therefore, it seems to me consistent with us approving business activity within town of Needham, that it would be appropriate for the finance committee to recommend adoption of Article 8.
I
That's
second
Dick's
that.
motion, seconded by Carol. Any discussion or comment?
I don't have a problem with the substance. I think it's good to have them in town, but I would feel more comfortable learning more about the compliance with the uniform districts before taking a vote.
Okay. Do others feel the same way?
It's not like there is precedent to doing this. About it coming up as an issue to this point.
So you're asking for the vote to be deferred, or you're just saying that you don't feel,
Yeah,
you'll feel comfortable voting yes without that being confirmed to you?
Right, to be able to have that information before I take a vote.
Okay, and what form would you want it in a memo or I mean, it was said to us today, so what further confirmation would you be looking for, just so they know if that's what we want to do?
I mean, I guess it would have to be a legal opinion. I think that's probably clearest.
Do you mean a legal opinion from town council?
If that's who you relied upon, I don't know what the basis of the current opinion is. If it's town council, then that would be clearest.
Of course, overlay districts, we use quite frequently in our town, so that a portion of a district you can have a certain thing. But it's true that the overlay district is shown on the map. Here, we're describing it in words, that it's, from this street over to here. It's similar in concept to an overlay district, but it's described in words rather than on the map. Would be the only difference I see.
But if what we need to vote is an overlay district, then that's what the wording should say.
We're not intending an overlay.
Okay.
We don't see a legal need.
We've never done that for just one use.
Yes, actually, I think the district that I referred you to was the neighborhood business district, and this is where we allowed an apartment or multifamily dwelling above the first floor in the area of where Pinellas Market is located. And so we allowed the use, and we said the provision only applies to the neighborhood business district, any portion of which is located within 150 feet of the Route 128 boundary, which effectively limited that use to a portion of that industrial district. So there's precedent for it doing it, and it has been utilized previously.
So, but that doesn't mean it's right.
Okay.
Just means we've done it once before and nobody questioned it.
I think that it's possible that that's the case. I understand the logic. I can also say that we've had multiple attorneys review this on behalf of the town, both town council and another attorney at town council's office. And these attorneys in particular are experienced, as Jean is, in drafting legislation that's compliant with with state law. And we have no reason to believe that this violates state law.
Dave, you had something?
Mr. Chair, I would just mention that the zoning bylaw amendments actually have to be reviewed after town meeting action by the Attorney General's office, and they opine whether or not the zoning change is legal. The previous change made to the zoning that Lee Newman made mention to passed us to with the Attorney General's office.
So I have a question.
Very good point.
Yeah, is there really any harm in getting an answer from council? Other than we're delaying the vote?
No, there isn't. And if that's, and obviously Josh wants to do it,
Right.
people feel that way as well. I don't want to stand in the way of it if it's something that people feel that we should have.
I mean, the financial impact I'm thinking of is what if there is a legal question down the road if this passes? Does that create liability for the town? I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand about liability. The only thing I can imagine is someone, a butter who doesn't want the use would say it's really not allowed because the zoning was didn't comply with the zoning law. Even though the Attorney General may very well prove it, I expect the Attorney General will approve it. But is that the kind of when you say liability, is that what you're speaking of? that there could be somebody challenging and bringing, saying a special permit shouldn't be granted because of this or something.
Or if there were challenges to a decision based upon the ambiguity in the law. The bylaw versus state law.
And it's the legal costs that the town might incur in that case that concerns you?
That's the financial impact. I'm thinking.
Typically, when you have a private party who wants to do something and an abutter who challenges it, it's the private party that bears most of the burden of the litigation, and town council kind of stands back.
So you'd like a response, you'd like an answer to that question.
Yes.
Okay, that's fair. And why don't we'll request that be looked at and we be given an opinion on it. And we'll hold off on this motion until we receive that.
Right, so we can just table the motion, so the motion still stands.
Yeah.
We still have the motion.
And town council would be the
Right.
authority that would be looking to, correct?
Correct.
Yes, Lee, Mr. Chair, may I ask and direct the town planner to speak urgently with town council to be able to provide a written opinion to the finance committee at the earliest possible opportunity on the extent on whether this proposed bylaw violates the state zoning act.
I don't think that it violates it. I
It's a
think it
question
is
of
in
spots on
compliance
it.
with it. I don't think anyone's accusing anyone of violating anything. Is it in compliance?
Yeah.
That's what we'd like to have confirmed for us.
Next Wednesday.
No, we're gonna meet the 12th, so so next Wednesday's a holiday, so it's gonna be the 12th. And if the sooner, if they can get it to ahead of time, we're not gonna require, and it's the answer that we're all expecting. We are not gonna need you to come, just as long as we get that ahead of time.
I'd rather my son come instead.
No. I mean, you're always welcome. You're always welcome, but okay. All right, so then we'll proceed in that direction.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right, Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so we're going to hold off on voting on Article 8 until we receive that opinion, and we'll do so at our October 12th meeting. So we'll turn next to Article 12 in the special town meeting warrant. So Dave, I think you'll speak to us on that, which is rescind debt authorizations.
Yes, Mr. Chair, the project, Jack Hogwell Building, the public storage facility that was constructed off of Central Ave is completed. The PPPC voted to close out the project, and of the original authorization, $2,218,000 would be rescinded by town meeting. Now, that does not mean the project came in at $1.3 million. Just to remind the committee, the total appropriation was $7,615,000, to which funding sources included contribution of free cash of $1,382,000 and sewer retained earnings of $944,000 and water retained earnings of $1,786,000, leaving the balance of the project to be funded by debt. The reason water and sewer contributed to the cost is that they have use of the facility for water and sewer enterprise assets.
Approximately 50% debt, 50% other sources.
Yes, correct. So back when it was approved, and how the rules work on authorizations is that cash is spent first and debt is the last, and hence $2,218,000 is not needed.
Was the original authorization, those were the amounts that were originally authorized from retained earnings, or that's what subsequently can be used?
The appropriation was $7,615,000, and the motion was at that 1,382,000 come from free cash
Right.
and 944,000 come from sewer.
So that was all from the original appropriation.
Yeah, just one article, the project was done, and to get the debt off, to prevent the borrowing, you have to rescind it.
Yeah.
And that goes to town.
And so the amount, the rescission again, I apologize, was 1 million.
2,218,000 even.
So has there been any analysis of, I mean, obviously it's good,
Right.
right? But it also makes you wonder, why did we appropriate that much to begin with? And I ask it because I know we're gonna have this discussion about Emery Grover and what is being held for contingencies and are too much being held for contingencies. And to me, this feeds right into that discussion that it seems out of whack that out of the 7.6 million, that 2 million was not ended up being needed. Now, again, it's a good thing.
It's almost 30%.
Right, but how could, we, is there a pattern here of sort of over asking and over protecting and over contingencyizing? I'll make that word up. And has there been any analysis or just that you've heard at the PPVC or other level about it? Because it just,
This particular project came in, the bid came in significantly below the cost estimates at PVC traditionally relies upon. And it was just a very favorable climate for bidding that the town saw, because as the committee may recall, it was only a matter of a year later that then bids started coming in almost at the appropriation amount. It was just a favorable market. It's and it is one of the higher percentage turnbacks that.
Well, it was a good turn back on Sunita Williams.
Right.
Well,
Right.
I mean, so there's two there that it just. So I asked that sort of as a coming attraction, because I know that I anticipate we're gonna have a pushback between what's gonna be requested for contingency on Emery Grover and what we think might be. I'm not pointing at you, David,
Yeah,
but
I understand.
but at what might be, the appropriate level. So.
Dave's not the conservative guy.
So I just raised that, not to say that we shouldn't, obviously this is good news, so we're gonna be doing it, but we have, until we rescind something, that borrowing is carried against our borrowing program, correct?
Correct. The town has the right to issue bonds and.
Up to that amount.
Up to that.
And when we do our 10% and other percent analysis, it's what we're authorized to borrow is what we hold as there.
Correct, until something is rescinded. My
Until it's-
practice is because the town still has the legal right to borrow, I always assume that it will borrow it until such a time that the town rescinds it or reappropriates it for another purpose.
Yeah. All the more reason to make sure that what you are borrowing, that you actually need it entirely, and that the contingency is well placed and whatnot. Okay, any other question on this?
If this passes, how much debt is available to be authorized in the future?
I haven't done that analysis. I mean, there's many moving parts. It's not an even one for one. It's not an even one for one trade-off, because it depends the types of product, the types of borrowing that's involved, the maximum allowable time for borrowing, and the intended debt structures at the time. So this does not, the fact that this is rescinding $2.2 million does not magically means that now you have $2.2 million to do for another project. You have to look at the planning and the financing of that project versus this project that's being phased out.
So maybe a more specific question, is passage of this article required to fund the borrowing in some of the other proposed warrant articles of this one?
No, this would not impact anything that currently is on the books or would impact any future appropriations. It would only come into play in my analysis, which would, that again always assumes that anything that's still open and authorized is going to be borrowed.
So you would have, said another way, if we didn't rescind this, there would be 2 million less that we could apply to a future project.
I would show what the impact of the $2.2 million is borrowed. In the case of this project, I would assume that would have been a 10-year bond, so that'd be about 220,000 in principal plus whatever the interest rate assumptions I have.
In the current year. So the impact in the current year is really only that portion that would be amortized plus the interest.
Correct. I mean, this has no impact
Right.
on
Right.
FY23 or FY24, but when we're looking at the major projects, there's a number of authorizations still open on ongoing projects. Again, I assume that they're going to be fully expended, and those would be shown in. There are things that show that which is already bonded, that which has been approved and not yet borrowed, and then I show the projects that are being proposed, and those are the three components that makes up those facility financing summaries that I do from time to time.
And this is general fund borrowing.
This was a general fund.
So does
within
that-
the 3%.
Does that mean that the proportion being paid by water and sewer changed?
No, water and sewer paid their share in
Cash, right, but they paid 1 million out of 7, and now they're paying 1 million out of 5.
Yes.
So they're paying more of the total project. essentially.
Proportion.
Correct, yeah.
Any,
Mr. Chair, I
Yes.
move that the Finance Committee recommend adoption of Article 10, Article 12 to rescind the amount of $2,218,000.
Second.
any question or comment? Hearing none, coming to a vote, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Next, we turn to Article 13, which is appropriate to capital improvement fund.
Yes, Chair, I asked out to you all a memo to summarize both the conversation that we have had this summer. It touches upon your agenda item at 8:15 and also the capital improvement fund. The capital improvement fund was the first special stabilization fund created by the town back in 2004. And the purpose of that was to set monies aside for the purpose of having them available at a time that was a needed minor building repair or facility repair or capital equipment that needed to be purchased, but because of economic stresses at the time, the funds were not available there to cover that appropriation. This fund was created because we had certain situations like that in the early 2000s where there was some needed capital repairs that had to be done. There was insufficient free cash. In fact, free cash at the time, 100% was being used for the operations of the town. And the town basically, but still needs to move forward with some, with a couple of the capital appropriations issued debt for items that we would traditionally have never issued debt. And then other items just were delayed yet another year, and it was a complicated period. And this was seen as a tool to plan and set funds aside. The two other funds that I talked about in the memo is the capital facility fund, which came 3 years later, but specifically at repairs and other necessary repairs that were planned for, but on the same basis that the funding was for some reason unavailable, and the town was not hoping not to issue debt. In the capital facility fund was geared specifically to town buildings and facilities. A few years later, the town, knowing that it was making a combination of investments in its athletic facilities, most notably by generous donations, particularly from one individual, in the millions, $6 million that did work on the Fazio and the Memorial Park, including the artificial turf on them. And it was a generous donation and it improved both sites, but there was a recognition that the carpet would have to be replaced, and it's an expensive item. And most notably, the fund was created to start putting funds aside, so all the monies wouldn't be needed, would not need to be raised in the year that the appropriation would occur. But the fund was written such that its athletic assets are and items that support athletics. And that's how we were able to put some funds aside when we were looking at the Memorial Park building as well, and funds put aside for that purpose. Now, in the conversations, they happened twice. Once was back in during 2019, looking at, there was questions that came from time to time from town meeting. Are there targets for these funds? Are they, what is an appropriate level for a target, or another way of saying a ceiling in terms of monies put into the funds? And the funds as established still as important today as at the time they were created. We had conversations and we came up with some concepts, but then COVID-19 happened and basically everything was put aside in terms of addressing those funds. This year, I mentioned to the committee about resuming those conversations and getting back to what we had planned. And that happened, the chair, vice chair, and one of the members that participated in that, well, actually two of the members, one's vice chair now, but, and another member who were part of that working group. We met this summer, and I brought back out what we had discussed and were thinking at that time. But what changed is, and it is what I presented to the select board last night, is the capital improvement fund was the removing the component about buildings and facilities from that, because basically the capital facility fund is doing that. So in leaving the capital improvement fund specifically to capital equipment, same intent and purpose is that fund set aside in there in case of a year that we would need a funding source, but was for some reason unavailable. And in terms of funding, what would be an appropriate target? Recommendation is that perhaps two of the most expensive types of equipment that the town would purchase, and it could be the amount that we could set the target for this fund. And that effectively is a ladder truck and a fire engine with a cost of $3 million. In the fund as of July 31st was $1.1 million, or that would be 37% of the suggested target. The next conversation, well, what sort of funds can government do? Now, from time to time, we've appropriated free cash or other one-time monies into the fund, but what would be a measure or something that something that happens with some sort of occurrence and something that was measurable? And the suggestion is that the proceeds from the sale of surplus equipment, that the amount that we raise from that could be the amount that would be appropriated to the fund. And what I provided for the committee in this memo, the history of the last 5 years of the amount of monies that have been generated from the sale of equipment. The other thing that I provided to the committee is how much has been appropriated to the fund in the last 5 years and how much has been appropriated from the fund. Nothing has been taken from the fund. And in the last 5 years, about $300,000 has been appropriated to the fund. Relative to the capital facility fund, there was no change to that. It's still focused on existing facilities, buildings and facilities. And the appropriations to the funds shown is in FY19, $1,817,000 and $505,000 in 2018. The only appropriation from the fund was the same $1,817,000, and that was for the high school expansion supplemental appropriation. And this is where the fund, where there were funds, this was truly a timing issue. The free cash was not available, and this fund was available to fund the appropriation. And the general consensus was that we would replenish the funds with the $1,800,000 when the free cash became available. And that's why you see that in and out the way that you do. And the suggestion, actually from our conversation as well, a funding source for this or a target amount could be the amount that is returned to free cash from the reserve fund with each year, or how much was returned in the prior fiscal year. And I provided for you a history, both what was the, and this is on page 2 of the memo, how much was the reserve fund set at in the last 5 complete fiscal years, and how much was returned to free cash in each of those years. The great volatility, of course, is
Snow and ice.
Snow and ice, and we've had the real last difficult year in snow and ice was in 2018, and even FY22, although we had a transfer from snow and ice, because which is the significant portion of the funds that we used in FY22 have not been as bad. And then lastly, the athletic facility fund that I addressed here in the memo. Specifically, the monies have been that have been going into it have been primarily from free cash in anticipation of these projects, and an amount that is generated by Park and Recreation from field use fees. And we've basically been taking about a 5-year average, and that's what's been appropriated into the fund. In FY22, that amount of $705,000 is both a combination of the savings in the carpet replacement project and as well as the appropriation of the 5-year average of Park and Recreation fees. The two that are not addressed here is the debt service stabilization fund, and as I spoke to the group, that is something that I would be coming back to both the select board and to the finance committee when I come up with the updated facility financing plan, which will be in November. And I'm looking at a concept of reconstituting that fund from what it was originally planned for, to look for our future capital investments to try to perhaps mitigate the impact of those larger projects in the out years. And I'm still in the process of crafting that. And then, of course, the last one is the general true stabilization fund that goes back to the 70s. That has basically been the concept of the ceiling of that would be 3% of the prior year operating budget, and that's been the basis of the funding of that. There has not been a contribution to that fund in years, and it's currently at about 2.3% of the prior year's operating budget, and that policy was actually crafted by conceived of the chair of the finance committee back in the 90s, Michael Fee.
So if I can distill all of that, which is very helpful. And start with this warrant article. Would it be safe to say that the capital improvement fund was picked out of the funds that money could be appropriated to, because that was that's one where we're sort of furthest off from our target?
Furthest off, and it's specific to the sale of surplus equipment. And that's how I came up with the amount.
Okay, so the amount is that amount is 351.62 is from that surplus equipment, as opposed to it's just extra tax money
It's not
that
extra tax money, it is proceeds.
proceeds. Okay.
That's coming.
So it seemed based on that being the source of the funds, and then the fund itself being the one where would be the appropriate for those proceeds to go to, because they are equipment. And then thirdly, that is the fund where we are probably furthest from the target. Those are the reasons behind this particular Article 13. Is that fair to summarize it that way?
That's correct.
All right, do people have, so this, what's that? I'd like to get that focus on, then we can go to the other stabilization funds.
Okay, it's staying with this one.
Staying
but
this one for a moment, see if we get that
just-
done, and then we can go to the other things.
A few questions. Is there any expectation that, well, let me rephrase that. I assume that the amending of the scope of what this will cover requires, is it a majority or a 2/3 vote by town meeting?
It is a majority in and 2/3 out.
But to change the language of which this proposes to do, not in this article, but the recommendation is that it be equipment only, right?
Equipment, but that actually doesn't require a town meeting vote, because that was the definition in the article information. That wasn't specific to
Okay,
to the language that was approved by town meeting.
just to follow up on that line, I assume that there is, even though we're narrowing, wouldn't be narrowing the scope, there's no expectation of transferring any of the funds into the capital facility fund. They would all stay in this fund, even though the scope is being narrowed.
Yes, because
I'm not arguing again. I
I
just
understand.
want to clarify that.
Yes. Yes, the funds remaining in this is for the purposes still of capital.
Any other, just focusing on this article itself, Josh?
The 351,662, from which fiscal years are those the sales?
So no, that's what's anticipated for fiscal 23 that we're in, yes, in terms of sales. So that's what it's based on.
And regardless of what the actual is, that's all, it could be higher or lower.
I expect it to be at least that. It may be more.
Okay.
And what I would do is look to future year appropriation. But that would be marked out.
And in the past, this money just went into the general fund.
No, it
No.
is general fund money. It would close out free cash.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, but
Louise?
So, and I just looked this up. So in the past, we haven't done it this way. We did it retrospectively. So once we had surplus sales in a fiscal year, it then went to free cash and we appropriated in the following fiscal year. I have zero problem with any of the concept, completely agree with all of it, but I do have a problem with it being called from the tax levy, because that's prospective. And I wouldn't want the levy to be raised in any way in order to put money into a fund.
I'm not raising it, not raising property taxes. This would be estimated receipts. There'll be a
So you're
non-recurring-
you're raising your estimated receipts on your,
Yes, because I've already
recap.
got 125,000 in the sale of surplus equipment just in the first 65 days of the fiscal year.
okay, so you're gonna estimate that at 351,662.
Correct.
Okay. Okay,
But in theory, if you don't hit that target, we appropriated this in theory from.
But it's still being estimated on. local
but it's
receipts.
still, yeah, so it's still estimated, so it won't raise the levy.
Right, okay. that makes sense.
Josh, you have a question?
No, that was.
I know it's very technical, but.
That's why you're here.
I don't want to
Police would be
raise,
lost without you.
I don't want to raise taxes unnecessarily.
I had suggested to Dave that one thing you might want to take a look at is the 5-year history of what we've appropriated for cash capital, and see how that stacks up against the 3 million.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
All right, would someone like to make a motion with respect to Article 13?
I want to approve recommend Article 13, appropriate capital improvement.
Is there a second for that?
Second.
Second by Dick. Any questions, comments? Hearing none, coming to a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to make an observation. While it's all well and good and commendable to be setting up reserves to cover against shortfalls, that is freezing money that is being set aside. So if we put it all together, you know, particularly if we hit all these targets, it'd be some 10 or $12 million being reserved and set aside. Query, do we need 5 or 6 different vehicles, or is the right approach to this one vehicle with a reduced amount that would have more flexibility? And I don't pretend to have a,
No, but you raise a good point,
conclusion.
and I expect, and I know that there are people out there who share similar views with you on that, and also wonder, you know, are we holding, particularly if you look at things that we've never touched, are we doing it?
Yeah.
You know, why are we holding things there to that degree? And especially if you follow that throughout on, like, for example, turning over the reserve funds in full every year, the return of that would make that one really big.
well, presumably we'd only do that up to the target funding level.
Up to, correct.
Mr. Chair?
Yep.
If I may. Also on that topic, the select board did actually ask me how quickly are we looking to get to the targets, and what I stressed is that our conversations weren't meant to get to the target at a specific date, but rather to know what a ceiling would be and what types of revenue would be the measure of going in there. So that's one of the, to the point, it's not as though we're rushing to put money aside to put it in there, but we identified something. So when town meetings ask them, well, how did you come up with these numbers? That's the purpose, is there's a methodology behind the amounts that are going in. And there's and reasonable people can reasonably disagree with what's the appropriate measure, but there is a measure of something of objectivity. In the case of the equipment, you can look up pricing. In the case of the capital facility fund, it's based upon 1% of the insured value of the buildings in town, excluding contents, excluding enterprise fund properties. And so it is something measurable. And then, of course, on the opposite side, if then, well, eventually the dollars are there, but things go up in cost. Both of those indexes that I referred to would inevitably also go up. So there's something built in to deal with inflation and such. But the key is it's not requiring us to be at the target at any specific point in time. And the select board seemed receptive to that approach.
Yeah, I think it's important too that the athletic facility improvement fund is a very different animal, because that's intended to be spent.
Mhm.
And it's a pre-funding mechanism.
Right.
Rather than a safety net.
It may rain someday.
Yeah.
It may rain someday.
No, I
right?
know. So
Yeah.
I think
there-
that,
There have been periods.
Right.
We haven't been in it for a while, but there have been.
exactly.
And
So
how big a rainstorm does it need to be? A little shower probably isn't enough.
they're finding that out in Florida right now.
Boy, you can be thankful for that. That's gonna help his presidential aspirations, isn't it? The hero.
If he
Yeah.
hasn't
It
come through.
remains to be
He hasn't come
seen.
through it yet. He hasn't come through. So, thank you. And with the, Dave alluded to a discussion that Louise and Dick, who's really been the champion of this for a bunch of years and making sure that we pay attention to it and sort of refine it. And the discussion we had when we met was working on this through the year and having it be something that we're going to make as part of our town meeting presentation. Next May is to have a full discussion in the finance committee report to town meeting about the stabilization funds and what they are, where they are, what they're for, what targets are, and sort of give a full-blown report on it. And so we're obviously not going to do it now or next for October 24th, but you'll be hearing more about this through the year. And that's what our intent is to have that be a report that we make to town meeting in May. Anything further for Dave on this right now? Thank you. Okay, so that leaves as our last item, any updates? I can report on wherever I listened to the PDBC meeting on Monday night. And then I think all of us saw the Excel spreadsheet that came out on the filed subbids that came in last Friday. And I think that to summarize it in layperson's terms, the subbids constitute about 40% of what we're expecting as the final bid. What they came in at show that what they're projecting as the deficit of 4.5 million is probably going to be the case. It wasn't a shock wave that it's going to be higher than that, and it could be lower than that, which is what we're all hopeful for. But it at least wasn't a horrible thing. And so the big thing is going to be when the bids come in on October 6th, and then we'll really know for sure ultimately what it's going to be. But I think the takeaway from the sub bids was that additional funding is going to be needed. And but it doesn't look like it's going to be needed in an excess amount over what they're predicting right now.
Fingers crossed.
Keep your fingers crossed.
There's
Right?
a school in the vineyard that just came in, the original approval was at 55 million. And the bids came in at 83 million.
So it's so we'll hear more at our October 12th meeting. We'll the bids are coming in on the 6th. We're having a chairs meeting on the 11th, and then we'll meet with everyone here on the 12th. So that's what I had as an update. Does anyone?
I meant to, and then frankly forgot to listen in. Ridge Hill was also covered.
Yeah, but those bids aren't in yet. I think those kind of this tomorrow. Yeah, so they're coming in tomorrow. They're hopeful based on sort of bidder activity they've seen, but until it shows up, they're not going to know for sure. So I think that'll be tomorrow. That's what I had by way of update. Anyone else have anything? Okay, so someone want to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second it? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. So our next meeting will be